Right, folks. So it's my great pleasure to welcome everyone to this afternoon's insight into the Ukraine. This is the first time that we have done a remote video link for these sorts of events. So welcome to all those who are joining us online. Welcome to all of those who are here physically in the Willis room. It is a real privilege to hear about something that is going on the news every day. Something tragic is unfolding. It is often very difficult to make sense of it. We get different views, different sources. Sometimes it's easy to just get completely muddled about whose intentions or what, why has this happened, what might happen. And that is where we are so grateful to have a real expert. So I won't do justice to Rear Admiral Chris Parry's full CV, but suffices to say that he spent over 30 years in the Navy, particularly in the Marines. He saw active service in the Falklands. Post-naval career, he's gone into defence studies, strategic work with the Royal United Services Institute. He's written, he's been on television, on Newsnight, and I can really think of no other better person to share their thoughts and insights about the tragedy that is unfolding in the Ukraine. So on all our behalves, Chris, thank you so much for giving up your time, and welcome back to PGS Remotely.
Okay, so let's just make sure we can do this. Can I just check, Simon, that you've got a picture now?
Absolutely, yes, that's excellent.
Good. Okay. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for waiting. I'm sorry about the technical difficulties. It's something to do with the Teams software on my Apple computer. So what I thought I'd start by saying is that in 1963, I was sitting in upper one classroom in the lower school, and I was being told by Mr. Line that we were within probably 48 hours of nuclear destruction, which was a bit odd when you were 10 years old. But at the time, we were under threat from the Russians in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I thought about this week when President Putin started threatening us with nuclear weapons if we didn't sort of back off from Ukraine. And it shows you how history is both continuous and constantly changing, in my view. So what I'd like to do today really is discuss with you some aspects of the conflict in Ukraine, why it's happened, but also give you some idea, I think, of the way the world is going, because many of you will inherit the world that I'm describing and have to deal with it. I think also we'll have time for questions if you're really up for that. So let me start. There's some pictures and maps which I hope will help us along the way, but do ask questions afterwards if you want to. I'm entirely at your disposal. Okay, so let's do a bit of history. Ukraine came about really because of the breakup of the Soviet Union. It had been a state of the USSR until obviously the end of the Cold War in 1989 to 91. And in 1994, a thing called the Budapest Protocol, which was signed by Britain, France, the United States, the EU, and Russia, most critically, gave assurances that Ukraine's borders, along with those of Belarus and Kazakhstan, would remain inviolate as long as they gave up the nuclear weapons that they had inherited from the old Soviet Union. I should also say that back in the 1950s, when Ukraine was part of the USSR, the sort of peninsula semi-island of Crimea, which sits on the bottom of Ukraine, had been given to the Ukrainian people as a gift by the Soviet Union. Of course, at that time, it was never envisaged that Ukraine would split from the USSR. So those two things need to be borne in mind while I'm speaking. Now, the real problem for Russia occurred in 2014, because until that time, Ukraine had been run by a largely pro-Soviet regime that looked a lot like the one in Belarus today. But the people decided they didn't like him very much because he went against a referendum which said that Ukraine wanted to join the European Union. He obviously, for survival's sake, said, I'm not going to go along with that. And the people promptly overthrew him. And since 2014, Ukraine has been an elective polity. It's rather corrupt, unfortunately, and they haven't really got some of their democratic institutions sorted out. But it is a democracy, and it wants to be more like us than it does Russia. The problem for President Putin is if Ukraine makes a success of being a democratic capitalist power, then people in Russia might start to think we might want to do that. And that's very bad when you're running an authoritarian state like President Putin is. So I'm rather hoping that we can move on. We can't. Okay, just a second. Okay, can you give me control, please?
I think can you not move on yourself? Is it not possible, Chris?
Not at the moment, no.
Right. Okay. Let's see if I can.
Okay. Was that me or you?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, that's good. Was that me?
Yeah, that was you.
Okay. So, okay, let's have a look at Ukraine itself. This is when Ukraine was intact. As you can see, you've got this very sort of large country, actually. It's as large as from Chicago to New York and from Raleigh in North Carolina all the way up to the Canadian border. So it's quite a significant country, as you can see, and the Russians are finding that at the moment, of course. The two features I really want to point out to you are the Dnieper River, which cuts basically the country in half, but also the Crimean Peninsula at the bottom. And you can see how that dominates the Black Sea. And on the Crimean Peninsula, you've got the port of Sevastopol, famous from the Crimean War, of course, but also Russia's only ice-free port from which it can deploy its warships. Every other port has ice problems, whether it's in Murmansk, in the Baltic, or out in Vladivostok. This is the only one where they can keep ice-free throughout the year. Okay, so let's see what's happened in the war so far. As you know, about 180,000 Russian forces surrounded Ukraine and invaded on the 24th of February from Belarus, a friendly country to Russia, and also from Russia itself and from Crimea, which from 2014, of course, has been held by President Putin. Why did they go into Crimea? And also the eastern part, which is around Luhansk and Donetsk in 2014. There are a number of reasons for that, mostly because of this threat by the Ukrainians to join the EU and NATO. And they felt at the time that there was a threat to their fleet base at Sevastopol, but also there are a number of other issues which I'll discuss with you later as to why they wanted to hang on to Crimea and indeed the eastern Donbass region around Luhansk and Donetsk. But at the moment, the priorities for Putin are to secure that coastal strip that goes down from Luhansk all the way down to Crimea. And I think you're going to see an opening of the campaign now to Odessa so that he can cut Ukraine off from the sea, from the Black Sea. He's also going to take all the country down to Kiev, I believe, and up to the Dnieper River. What he'll do afterwards, I'll discuss with you later. But just have a look at the geography. Remember how it's split in half and the importance of Crimea. Okay, I'm sorry about the blurry bits on this slide, but I just want to show you how the country splits in terms of climate, because it's actually quite important. Up near Kiev, look, on the Dnieper River, it's pretty warm, got quite a lot of moisture. You've got a warm and stable central belt, and then you've got very warm, hot and dry regions down to the south. More importantly, look at the geography and geology. You've got mixed forest to the north, you've got forest steppe in the middle, and you've got steppe, which is hot, arid, dry, wheat and sort of other sort of cereal producing areas to the south. Now, this is quite important you keep this in your mind because it actually dictates what's happening. Okay, we've seen the Russians. They've come in strength, as I said, about 180,000, of which 60 to 70,000 are frontline combat troops. They're deploying these sorts of capabilities. There's a lot of support troops as well, but they're very heavy in armor. And as you can see, artillery. They're also backed up by a vast array of missiles and artillery systems, predominantly, as you see, from the sea and from these multiple rocket launchers. And this is what is causing the devastation in many of the cities at the moment. They're also supported by the Russian Air Force, not in great strength, by the way. They've committed very few of their frontline forces, including these MiG-35s, but also quite a lot of ground attack aircraft that you can see, Sukhoi 25s, and these Mi-28 attack helicopters, which are a bit like our Apaches, to tell you the truth. And more importantly, they've deployed significant air defenses. These are the S-300 weapon system. This is the system that shot down the Malaysian airliner, if you remember, in 2014. They've got several of these, well, lots of these deployed around the place. In fact, the Ukrainians have captured
Watching the war on the computer
as well. And 4 days ago,
this is John Parry.
Can I just ask everyone to stay muted apart from our speaker, please?
And 4 days ago, they put 4 large amphibious ships through the Bosphorus just before the Turks closed the straits. And those of you historians will know that under the Montreux Convention in 1930, if a war is going on within the Black Sea, then no warship is allowed to transit the Bosphorus under the terms of that treaty. But they got them through in time. And this is a picture taken from the beach in Odessa. And you can see where the Russians are poised to intervene probably over the next couple of days or so. Now, what's really interesting is that Russia has some very capable kit. You've got one of the best submarines in the world called the Akula 2.5. You've got the T-90 tank and very advanced combat aircraft and other forces. Now, the question is, why haven't they committed these to the fight in Ukraine? Well, the answer is that President Putin and his circle judges us in the West by his standards. So he's worried, or he was worried, that the West might intervene, despite what we were saying, that we would intervene in support of Ukraine. He's kept some of his best units and personnel back in case. That means that the invasion force in Ukraine right now is not of the best quality, either in terms of equipment, sustainability, fuel, stores, things like that, and indeed personnel as well. And you'll have seen that actually they've had a hard time of it dealing with the Ukrainians, and indeed they've run out of fuel, supplies, food even, and things like that. That's why that's happened. They also haven't committed their best combat aircraft to the fight. And the Ukrainian Air Force, with their MiG-29s, which are pretty outdated now, are doing pretty well against the Russian forces that have been committed. Another indication that he's holding something back is that the majority of his ballistic and air-launched missiles have not been deployed to Ukraine. Again, this is just in case NATO decides it wants to intervene. Now, from the Russian point of view, this is not a map that they recognize. This is how you and I look at Europe, and you can see where Ukraine is, very, very strategically placed in Central Europe and also on the Black Sea. One of the most important things about Russia is it's 10 time zones wide, which is really, really big. And the bulk of the population actually lives in the west, to the west of the Urals. As you can see, the bulk of it is there. So their focus in that part where they live is predominantly to the west, and threats that they perceive come from the west. Now, you and I both know the NATO alliance is a defensive alliance. We have no intention of repeating the mistakes of Hitler and Napoleon, but the Russians don't see it that way. They see a very vulnerable country, very large country, with a population of only 149 million to cover that vast expanse of both land and sea. Now, this is a front page of Time magazine in 1954, and it's partly a commentary by President Khrushchev. And he said, look, there's this tiny promontory on the end of our continent. It's called Europe. He said, the Russians are nowhere to be, the Americans are nowhere to be seen, but there are two arms that reach out and strangle Mother Russia. And remember where the population is, okay? They are the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and they are the Baltic. And Russian policy since the 1917 revolution is to attempt to neutralize any threats coming from the Baltic and the Black Sea. So let's have a think what happened at the end of the Cold War. You'll remember that the bulk of Eastern Europe was in the hands of the control of the Russians. But look at what happened. All they ended up with in terms, excuse me, in terms of beachfront property in the Baltic is Kaliningrad, which is that tiny exclave you see between Poland and Lithuania. Used to be called Königsberg. when it was German, and the approaches to St. Petersburg. So they're a bit concerned about controlling the Baltic, one of these arms that reaches round and strangles them. And the bulk of Russian military exercises over the past few years have concentrated forces similar to those that surrounded Ukraine in the northern region, in the Western Military District, opposite the Baltic republics, Belarus and Poland. And that's because they were pretty worried about what NATO might do in that northern region. Whether that was justified or not, who can say? Let's go down to the Black Sea. At the end of the Cold War, look, they had very little beachfront property. All they had was that little strip by Sochi between Georgia and Ukraine. And so, as you can see, from a Russian point of view, they're not doing anything to neutralize what they perceive to be threats from the Baltic and the Black Sea. Now, one of the indicators of where the Russians really think they need to look out is where they deploy these weapon systems. Now, this is an S-400 anti-air and anti-missile system, and it can bring things down up to 200 kilometers away. So it's a pretty powerful strategic system. And in terms of our own capability, the only NATO aircraft that can really survive in this environment are the F-22 Raptor and our own F-35, which is just coming into service, as you know, with our carriers. So where the Russians are interested is indicated normally where they deploy these systems. And as you can see with the red circles, don't worry about the amber ones, but the red circles, you see, you've got the Murmansk, the Northern Fleet Base at the top. You've got St. Petersburg and Moscow. They've got one in Kaliningrad. There's a surprise. They've got another one down in the Crimea and one in Syria as well. So you can see where their strategic interests are, simply where they have put these very powerful anti-air systems. So let's have a look at Ukraine from a different perspective. Okay, I've already said to you it sits in the middle of Europe here, between Russia and Western Europe. Okay, and let's probe that a bit further, shall we? Okay, have a look at the geography again and look at this thing called the Great European Plain to the north of the Carpathians and leading into Russia. From a Russian point of view, if you lose Ukraine, as you can see on the right, it not only gives you a route to invade Russia or attack Russia through the Baltic republics, but also through Ukraine. Now, if you look at the map again, and that's quite an easy route, by the way. There aren't many rivers, there aren't many mountains, as you can see. Okay, and the Russians would prefer it if we stayed behind the Carpathians to the west. Okay, now, if you look at those twin arrows on the right-hand map, that is precisely the route that Hitler took to invade Russia with Operation Barbarossa in 1941. And so they're very, very nervous about yielding any land that will allow people to get closer to Moscow. Now, look at the fact that Belarus, if Ukraine joined NATO or the European Union, would be surrounded on three sides by NATO or NATO-friendly countries. And that puts Moscow within 400 kilometers of NATO territory. More importantly, if you look to the east of Ukraine, there is a city on the river the Volga River called Volgograd, and the smarter ones amongst you will know what that was called in World War II. It was called Stalingrad, and that's only 300 kilometers away. And if NATO were to attack Volgograd, you wouldn't want to, you would disrupt all the traffic on the Volga and all the energy supplies coming up from the Caspian Sea. So that is why the Russians really don't want to lose Ukraine to the Western Alliance, because from the Black Sea point of view, and also from the North European plain point of view, they think they're incredibly vulnerable to attack. Okay, the other reason Ukraine's important is that in the past, it has been a major component of the way in which Russia gets the oil and gas to the West. The problem is the Ukrainians promptly, they got their sort of independence, started charging the Russians for the pipelines that go through Ukraine. It was never thought, of course, under the USSR that they'd ever have to pay for it. But at one stage, they were paying $5.5 billion a year just to get that oil and gas going through Ukraine. Now, since 1994, the Russians have built and sponsored other pipelines through the Black Sea, another reason why they want to dominate it. They're called Turk Stream and Blue Stream, as you see. They've also built Nord Stream through the Baltic and the one through Belarus and Poland. So they're trying to bypass Ukraine. But the problem is that they still rely on that pipeline, those pipelines to get stuff to the West at the moment. And remember, gas constitutes 35% of Russia's foreign state earnings. The other thing about Ukraine is it's a massive breadbasket. It produces huge amounts of wheat and cereals. It produces 90% of all the rapeseed oil in the world today and has huge agricultural facilities, particularly in that central belt that I showed you earlier on. And here's another thing that Putin's taking note of. He knows he's got a declining population. The best estimate is it stays static in Russia, but look at some of the projections for the low variant. If it's low, and the projections are that it will be somewhere between the medium and low variant, the population of Russia could be less than that of the UK in 2050, the way things are going at the moment. I should say that Ukraine's population is also declining, but something in the back of Putin's head says, if I get Ukraine back, I get 42 million people back. And that significantly helps my labor force and also my military capability as well. Now, one of the reasons that Putin invaded Crimea and the eastern Donbass region in 2014 is because Exxon and Mobil decided they were going to start developing the oil and gas that was in Ukraine. Now, the bulk of it is offshore off the Crimea, as you can see, but the second biggest fields are in the east of the country, Donetsk and Luhansk. Now, the critical thing here is there is enough oil and gas in those regions to displace Russia as the primary supplier of oil and gas to Europe within 10 years. And that's one of the primary reasons why Putin invaded in 2014 and seized the Crimea. Sevastopol, of course, was really important, but this was far more critical. They would lose nearly 50% of their GDP if Ukraine was able to steal the European market from them. And so that can also, when Putin seized Crimea in 2014, the Ukrainians retaliated by switching off the water supply that came from the river Dnieper to the north down the canal that you can see into Crimea, which means that today Crimea has only 7% of the water it needs to sustain its agriculture and urban communities. And so the fact that Crimea has been cut off from the rest of Russia by Ukraine and the water has been drained, as you can see, was another major reason why Putin wanted to join up the breakaway republics in the east, in the Donbass, with Crimea, so he could actually supply it with water. So altogether, the oil and gas and the water issues, when they seized Crimea in 2014, this is the effect of what happened. If you look on the left, the economic zone that went to Russia as a result of stealing Crimea from Ukraine was quite significant. It enabled them to dominate in economic terms the Black Sea, as you can see. You can see the difference on the right between before and after the invasion. It totally shuts the Ukrainians out from the bulk of their coastline, indeed 2/3 of it, and leaves them that tiny access point around Odessa to the west. And of course, from Sevastopol, they can dominate the Black Sea militarily with their air and surface missile platforms. Now, there's another important thing that plays here. Look at the linguistic and ethnic division in Ukraine. Remember I told you about that hot arid region to the south? There's another division that splits mainly along that sort of design. Most of the Russian speakers and those who come from Russia ethnically live in that southern part. And bizarrely, they live in the part that Catherine the Great used to call New Russia. And New Russia is something that I think that President Putin is seeking to recreate. And I think as a result of this war, you'll see the area covered by what is yellow on the right-hand map, totally absorbed into Russia, including the Crimea, the land bridge that enables them to supply and provide water. And also, I think you're going to find that he will occupy the area to the east of the Dnieper River. That means he'll leave the basic Polish-Lithuanian ethnic group to the northwest to its own devices. As long as they stay quiet, he won't interfere. But my forecast is that he will occupy what is seen on the right-hand side as Little Russia, to the east of the Dnieper, and the red region where the bulk of the Russian and ethnic and linguistic people are. And New Russia will be absorbed, I think, to Russia itself. Okay, other places they're interested. Remember, we had the S-400 system dominating Syria. Now, President Putin's not there for supporting primarily Bashar al-Assad. He's not there to fly paper the jihadists who otherwise would go back to Russia. He's there to keep an eye on the gas fields that are here as well. Now, Putin said recently, with regards to the Eastern Mediterranean, if we're not at the table, we're going to be on the menu. And it translates pretty well from Russian, I have to tell you. And so yet again, he has found another part of the world where if the gas is developed, it can displace Russia's exports to Europe. And of course, he's very sensitive about that. And I should say, for completeness, he's also obsessed with the security of the Arctic for two reasons. One is the access that can be gained across the top of the pole by NATO countries like Canada and the United States, but also in the European theatre by Norway and Denmark. But the most important thing is, with the melting of the ice cap, we're getting sea routes that are available 5 months of the year in ice-free conditions between the Pacific and the Atlantic. That means if you take a ship along that route, you save $350,000 worth of fuel, and you save 10 to 15 days sailing time than if you went through the Suez Canal. And we're seeing now the progressive militarization of the Arctic to ensure that interlopers don't come in. In fact, there's a little dispute with China at the moment over the activities of Chinese icebreakers in the Arctic. They're called Snow Dragon 1 and Snow Dragon 2, but don't expect originality from the Chinese. Now, this is part of a broader canvas that I think you need to pay attention to in the future. Now, what we're seeing more and more now is Russia and China aligning and with Iran as well as a junior partner to dominate the whole continent of Eurasia and the waters around it. So that's Russia in the west and to a smaller extent in the east. That's China in the Asia Pacific and Indian Ocean, and Iran in the greater Middle East. And they have a geopolitical compact together, which indicates that they intend to work together geopolitically and economically. And that's cemented by a $560 billion deal between Putin and Xi Jinping in 2015 that promised to deliver oil and gas, despite any climate commitments, to Xi Jinping by 2048 in return for that huge amount of money. This is why he can wage war on the scale he is at the moment. But be in no doubt, these authoritarian powers look set to try and dominate the whole of our continent. They refer to Western Europe, for example, as a tiny collection of states on the end of our continent. So what's really interesting, though, is that we're seeing the maritime democracies, which I'll talk about in a minute, opposing this Eurasian domination. So we're going to see more and more now China, Russia and Iran acting together, and you can see the land area that actually they're seeking to dominate, and the other countries they're seeking to bring into their alliance. And that's both economic and diplomatic. So how's the world going to be in future? Well, we're going to see an age of mass migrations because of climate change, because of economic opportunity, because of demographic explosions in certain parts of the world, principally in the greater Middle East and in Africa. We're going to see huge migrations around Europe and other places as well. The state has returned massively. About 10 years ago, we were saying, oh, it's multinational corporations that are going to run the state of the world. Everybody will be rushing to Davos to work out how we can run globalization. But no, the state has come back with absolute force. And that's been typified by the powers that states have aggregated to themselves by during the COVID pandemic. We're also back in an age of empires. And this thing in Ukraine with Russia is really an attempt to re-establish Russian dominance over what used to be the Soviet Union. So all those countries that used to be part of the Soviet Union President Putin wants to bring into his orbit. He either wants to neutralize the threat, exploit their economic potential, or make sure that they don't misbehave. And what he's saying with his invasion of Ukraine is, look, I don't have to invade you guys, Kazakhstan or anything else ending in stan. You can see what I've done to Ukraine. I can do that to you. Now behave. So that's one empire. The Chinese empire, all the rhetoric in China right now is re-establishing China as a hyperpower, as the middle kingdom. And they talk about expanding into the Asia Pacific to create a trade and tribute hub that is reminiscent of the Ming Dynasty in the 16th century. They constantly refer to it. And the Belt and Road Initiative, which are the new Silk Roads across Central Asia to Europe and through the Indian Ocean, again reflect what happened under the Ming Empire. And Xi Jinping is very much modeling their future geo-economic model on the Ming Empire of the 16th century. You could say that America is struggling to retain its empire, which is globalization. You look at the Turks and they say they're Ottomanizing their policy. That means they have interests and they have footprint in the Caucasus, in the Balkans, down into the greater Middle East and across North Africa. And finally, you could say that we are being a bit imperial at the moment because we're talking about global Britain, which really takes in most of the old Commonwealth and indeed our old empire as well. So that's coming back. But the fact of life is the world we're going to have to live in future is a two-block world. It's those Eurasian autocrats, China, Russia and Iran, really lining up against what I call the maritime democracies, United States, Canada, Europe even more so after what's happened in Ukraine, United Kingdom, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and critically India as well. And what joins them? Well, they're all democracies. They all speak by and large English. And of course, they're linked by the sea. And in future, it's going to be a fight in geopolitical terms over the rest of the countries of the world. Which bloc will they adhere to? And the elites in those countries will actually look to their interests, both political and economic, in terms of regime legitimacy and their own national interests to say which side to which they want to adhere. So let's talk about Saudi Arabia. Where will Saudi Arabia go? It's an authoritarian state, of course it is, and it's worried about Iran. And it may feel that by cozying up in future to China, then it'll be safe from Iran because Iran does what China tells it to do. Alternatively, those countries that prefer being in a democratic bloc with all the values and systems that they want to benefit from, they might want to go towards the democracies. But one thing we're going to have to get used to in between those two blocks is a lot of coercive diplomacy and the use of the military instrument of power. Now, you could say we've just lost Afghanistan to the Eurasian autocrats. We may be about to lose Ukraine. And this is going to be a pattern in future, I think. And what we're going to see, again, the historians will know this, it'll be Lord Palmerston rules, which are, he said, countries don't have any permanent friends or enemies, they have permanent interests. And probably the smartest thing that I've heard recently is this. And that is President Trump, believe it or not. He said that. And the fact he can use the word exacerbate properly is a miracle, it seems to me. There we go. Now, the good news is, in history, maritime alliances always defeat continental alliances. Why is that? Because the sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web. Everything that goes on the World Wide Web actually, in reality, goes by sea or above it. And what makes it even closer, of course, is the cables that carry the internet are largely submarine cables as well. So the good news is that's the case. Why? Because if you dominate the sea, you can dominate the linkages between commodities, raw materials, manufacturers, and markets. That is why China is building a big navy now to contest what we have at sea. Okay, let's have a look at Russia and China, what they're up to at the moment. Iran too. They're state-based conglomerates, they're managed societies and economies, and they've thoroughly economically infiltrated the West. All they talk about at the moment is mobilization and modernization. They want to recover their rights. They don't like the current rules. They felt that when they were subordinate, they signed up to these things without really knowing what it meant. And they really want to change the world in their image. They're doing strategic mirroring, which means they're copying what we do in terms of the way they put their influence around the world. They're engaging in competition. They want exclusive space around them, and they want to set up a Eurasian trade bloc. And that's really interesting because it means that we're not only sort of competing in strategic terms, but also in trade, in commerce as well, along these two block lines. They talk about a strategy of active defense. You and I call that attack, by the way, and limited actions. And bear in mind that President Putin called what happened in Ukraine, okay, a special operation. He didn't call it war. He didn't call it conflict. It's a limited action. They're also talking about financial intervention and financial warfare. And everything I read in Russian, and ever since I was at the grammar school, I've been able to read Russian. Okay, they talk about the de-Americanization of the world and its institutions. And they're saying we'll either have new rules or we'll have no rules. So what does that mean? This is President Putin speaking about a month ago. I agree with him on the first paragraph, by the way. Now, in the second paragraph, it's quite important because the whole financial system of the world relies on the reserve currency that is the dollar. Now, as you know, we put really serious sanctions on Russia as a result of the invasion of Ukraine by evicting them from the SWIFT system. This is the global dollar payment system. And what Putin is saying is we don't want to be constrained by this in future. We've got to reduce our reliance on the dollar and the Western financial system. And indeed, if you look at all the institutions of Western financial management on the left-hand side, you're seeing that they're being duplicated by institutions that have been set up by the Eurasian autocrats, China, Russia, and Iran. And what's really interesting is they're looking to develop their own payment system and their own World Trade Organization rules in order to compete with the West. And this will intensify the two-block division in the world. So it's not just strategic and military, it's going to be financial and commercial as well. And you'll see these two blocks trading increasingly together and less across the boundaries because there'll be so many sanctions and counter sanctions in place that it will almost be impossible to conduct normal trade and financial deals. They're also cooperating militarily together. More and more now, China and Russia and Iran are cooperating. But the most dangerous thing in this picture is it seems the Russians have developed a naval camp you can land a helicopter on. So what's going to happen in geoeconomic terms? Okay, your parents will know this already. We're in an age of debt, default and deficit because of the 2008 financial crisis. There's not a lot of flexibility in the world system. It can be subject to real economic shocks. We're inflating at the moment, which means the price of goods is increasing all the time. But I think it's biflation. It's a term I've invented. The price of things we really need, like energy and food, are going to increase in future. Okay, but the things we don't need, like Blu-ray disc players and T-shirts, are going to deflate. So they're going to reduce in price because we're grossly oversupplying them at the moment. But we're going to live in a connected but contested world. And that two-block structure is going to bear more and more on the way we do things. And in terms of how we deal with that other block, we're going to cooperate where we can, okay, but we're going to have to compete where we must. And that's going to be the way of the world in future. And I think the world now is de-globalizing, and we are going to progressively decouple our reliance on Russia, China, and Iran for energy, but also every other thing. Remember that at the start of COVID, the only place we could get PPE and masks and things was from China. That was a really poor sort of monopoly, which they dominated and charged us billions for. What you're seeing now is what is known as onshoring, a return of manufacture and quite a lot of business to home countries. Climate change is also accelerating this. We're seeing more local to local business and a restructuring of supply chains around the world. The whole globalization thing is falling apart in front of us. There's a pressing need for automation in Western countries. Why? Because we're losing skills needed for the sort of things that we need to do to manufacture. And also, of course, our working age population is reducing as well. There's going to be a technology arms race, particularly for AI and more advanced technologies, quantum technologies and nuclear fusion and things like that between us and this other bloc. And we're going to see an intense cyber environment. And I think in future, you're going to see the internet split down into discrete parts so you can protect it from the worst of the cyber malware and all the other things that will be put in the system, not just by individuals, but by states. And finally, I'm afraid, get used to more expensive food and energy. The sort of prices you're paying in Aldi right now, you'll be paying Marks and Spencer's prices by next year, I think. Oops. And finally, what's Putin going to do next? Well, a lot of people say, well, he's going to have a go at the Baltic states. I don't believe he will. He understands the dangers of attacking a NATO country. But this is the president of Belarus thinking he's giving a really important briefing. But what he's giving away is that part of the plan is to invade Moldova as part of going across the bottom of Ukraine and taking that region as well, so that they have a border with Romania. So Moldova better look out, because it's got a Russian minority in it. So in summary, what I think will happen is he will occupy Ukraine to the east of the Dnieper. He will totally occupy that region known as New Russia across the bottom of the country, cutting Ukraine off from the Black Sea. And he will leave that rump of the northwest to the west of Kiev to its own devices, as long as it stays neutral. Just for those of you who don't know where Moldova is, there it is, as you can see, down to the southwest of Ukraine. And I think that's his next target. So I'll leave you with this quotation from Winston Churchill, which actually sums up why you should never have a strategy of wishful thinking, and you should indulge in statesmanship and preemptive actions to stop these crises occurring. And I don't think I've ever found in my time as a historian a better 3-paragraph instruction on how to conduct this sort of crisis management. I'll let you read it, and then I'll be happy to answer questions.
Chris, thank you so much. That was, in many ways, overwhelming, sobering, but so well delivered, and I know has given rise to lots of questions. So I'm going to ask, perhaps if I may, some of our students here if they've got questions first. We've got about 5 minutes or so. So yes, do you want to come up so we'll talk to the owl?
Has everybody
just sort of shout very loud.
What's the percentage of the fact that there's going to be a war? How likely is it?
Do you mean well, there's a war, it's a world, yeah, a World War III, Chris. What are the chances of that?
No, not a chance. I'm afraid to say within this audience, I'll say to you that Ukraine is more important to Putin than it is to the West. And so I'm afraid that the West will let him settle on his gains, I think. And as long as he doesn't enter NATO territory, I think we're all safe.
I'd like to ask about how the Russian machine is currently working. I know there were interviews with captured Russian soldiers who claimed they were told they were going on a training exercise, and they didn't know until they got to Ukraine that they were invading Ukraine. So overall, how is sort of Putin running the Russian machine at the moment?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. 40 years ago, I was in the Falklands War, and quite a lot of the conscripts and other soldiers there were convinced they were in Argentina. They weren't in the Falklands at all. And they've been told also they've been going on an exercise. I'm afraid this is a feature of dictatorships, that they find it very difficult to motivate their people other than lying to them. Now, I said earlier that the Russian forces in Ukraine are variable quality. They've got some very good ones, but they've also got some really poor ones. And so a lot of the things that you've seen in terms of prisoners and people crying and going back to arms and all that sort of thing relate to, I think, the lower end of the spectrum. It's the same with the kit. I mean, one of the reasons, it's quite interesting, I didn't think that Putin would invade in the end. I thought he was actually sort of threatening and playing poker. What I think decided the situation on February the 23rd for the invasion on the 24th is that Putin suddenly realized he was losing support in Russia for action against Ukraine. After all, they're cousins, really. It's like the relationship with the Ukrainians and the Russians is a lot like that between the English and the Scots in sort of cognate terms. So they don't really like the idea of fighting fellow Slavs, particularly those, of a fellow similar origin. So he detected there was declining support. The other thing was, I think his generals told him, look, we've been out here for 5 weeks. We're going to have to rotate these forces. The kit's breaking down. People are getting cold and hungry. We're not supplying properly. It's quite difficult. Unless we go now, we're going to have to rotate these forces. And I think in order to sustain the momentum, they decided they had to invade at that point because it was going to be now or never. And I think an indication of how bad the kit was running down and how poorly supplied they were was the performance of those Russian troops in the early stages of the conflict. And that reflected how they were, I think, when they started. But be in no doubt, Russia has huge mass and technological superiority, and it can bring in forces not only from the rest of the Western military district, but also from the Asia Pacific and Central Asia as well. I mean, this is a meat grinder of capability, which can do immense damage to Ukraine. And I think those of you who do Latin will remember the Tacitus quotation about Roman armies. He said they create a desolation and call it peace. Well, I'm afraid the Russians are signed up to that as well. So I'm afraid unless we can get Ukraine declared a humanitarian disaster at international level, they will just go on and do what they want to do in Ukraine.
How far do you think that US civilian outrage will prompt some kind of action from the Biden administration, severe or not?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, if I were giving advice to President Zelensky right now, I'd be saying inflict as much damage and pain on a particular section of the Russian armed forces as you can. Don't try and do everything at once. Obviously, hold your lines, but really inflict a lot of damage on one of those axes of attack. And at the same time, start crying really loudly that there's a humanitarian disaster about to happen in Ukraine. And the longer they can hold out and the more they can push the humanitarian line, then I think you'll find that the response, not just from the US, but from the world community, will build. And I think what Putin is trying to do is capture as much of the country for negotiating purposes as he can before that backlash occurs. I'm afraid under the leadership of President Biden, you can expect very little in the way of initiatives. I think at the moment there's an apathetic approach to Ukraine and one which the American people at the moment don't seem inclined to take part in. I think in their minds, apart from some of the Republican elite, they've given Ukraine up as a lost job and are now concentrating on making Ukraine be as troublesome to Putin as possible. But bear in mind, the Americans have put in place very, very coercive economic and financial sanctions, which in some cases blow back on Americans as well. So they've got a stake in this. But be in no doubt, the Americans will use the Ukraine issue not only to galvanize support in Europe for a tougher stance against Russia militarily and strategically, but also in relation to China as well, because they'll say, that's what Russia does. Look at the other half of this alliance. China does this as well. This is what authoritarian powers do. You're seeing a major reorientation of geopolitical pieces on the ground at the moment.
Yes, Madeline.
I was wondering if you thought there was a chance that the footing might be disrupted by actually a Russian kind of civilian, well, not uprising, but kind of that might cause Putin to rethink. Obviously, he could suppress it, but in terms of actually him being ousted from power by someone close to him who doesn't think they should go the whole way or something like that, just in terms of Russia domestically.
Yeah, thank you very much. The chances of a Russian uprising are zero. If you look at the Russian media outlets, most people above the age of 40 think this is great. This is what great powers do, and Russia is a great power. It deserves to be a director on the board of the world. And anyway, America does this to other people, so why shouldn't we do it? So you're going to find very little support for an uprising in what I would call the early to late middle age bracket. People your age and the youngsters are pretty fed up because they thought they were living in a cosmopolitan world where they can enjoy all the benefits that you and I enjoy. But that's not enough to get a critical mass to get rid of Putin. Now, it's quite interesting that I was going to be the defense attaché in Moscow in 1998. And as part of my briefing, I was told by a lot of Russians, because it was chaos at the time under Boris Yeltsin, all we need now is a nice Stalin. And it's what the Russians think they've got right now. And around him, you've got he's got to keep three constituencies happy in Russia. He's got to keep the armed forces happy, and they're happy. They've got lots of investment. They're being used and all that sort of thing. The oligarchs, of course, there's about 35 of them who prop up his regime in economic terms. But also there is a group of people called the Siloviki. They're the ex-KGB and security FSU people around him. And there's about half a dozen of them. They're real hard men. And everybody says, oh, let's get rid of Putin. That's the answer to our problems. It isn't. Behind Putin, there are some really nasty people. People who in 2014, if NATO had intervened in the Crimea occupation, publicly said, oh, let's use nuclear weapons. You know, let's not think twice about it. We're a big country. We can take it. Now, that's dangerous. But these Siloviki, who are his Praetorian Guard around him, have their control on all the levers of power in Russia right now, and the forces of repression as well. Now, I think Putin has cancer at the moment. If you look at his physiognomy, it looks like he's on steroids or treatment. People jokingly have said, look, he uses these very long tables to interview people. I think his immune system might be suppressed at the moment, so he's a man in a hurry. But I'm afraid to say that if you replace Putin, you're going to replace him with somebody very similar, if not worse, to tell you the truth. So somehow we've got to deal with the power centers in Russia the way they are, rather than the way we'd like them to be. I hope that answers your question.
Hello, Chris. Thank you so much for a really informative talk. I just wanted to ask you a question on behalf of my GCSE geography students. So
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. We look at Ukraine as an example of the UK's role in the conflict. What do you think about the UK's role in Ukraine over the past 8-9 years?
Okay, what we've tried to do is boost the institutions of Ukraine and make them more like a modern democracy. It's been hard work because the country has been inherently corrupt in its institutions and the way it runs its economy and some of its what we call its compliance systems. It hasn't helped itself in that respect. That's a hangover from the old communist days, unfortunately. We've also tried to give them aid, and we've also tried to build capacity, as we call it, in the banking and in the defence sectors. Just before the invasion, we actually agreed to build 2 naval bases for them and to supply them with some fairly advanced modern fast attack craft, which they were going to supply themselves. One thing I didn't mention, by the way, is Ukraine has a very, very capable and technologically agile defense industry and produces all sorts of missiles and other things for predominantly countries in the wider world. So that's one other thing that President Putin was seeking to knock out. But the relationship with Ukraine was building quite steadily beforehand. And you'll see the sentiment expressed by the government in terms of how Ukraine has been dealt with. And to be fair, the government has been in the forefront of both asking for sanctions and hoping to deal further coercive measures on the Putin regime. I'm afraid to say that the regime will have already calibrated the measures that will be taken against them. The macroeconomics in Russia are actually quite good at the moment. Excuse me a second, I'm going to take a drink. And you can actually sustain quite a few of these things. I was talking to some Russian academics recently, and they said, look, we don't really care if Russia suffers. We're used to this sort of thing from the West, from Hitler, Napoleon, and everybody else. And as long as the West suffers more than we do, we can take it. It's in the Russian mentality. But you're right. You know, we tried to strengthen, we've tried to build capacity, we've tried to make it look more like, and we've succeeded in most of the countries of Eastern Europe up till now. Everybody thought that, you know, Ukraine would be the next one we could do that with. But what you have to remember, GCSE geography class, is that Ukraine is to the east of the Carpathians, which is really the marker for Russia when the West becomes a threat.
Okay. I think, Chris, if that's okay with everyone else, we've got to 5 o'clock, because I know we did sort of promise a finish time there. I'd like to thank all those who've joined us remotely. I do hope, you found it, insightful, just extremely knowledgeable. And I just really appreciate, Chris, the way you blended in the history, the geography, the international relations. And it really, if nothing else, just reminds us how interconnected the world is. It's about what's happened in the past. It's about national cultures, national aspirations, but it's also governed by the geography, the seas, the mountains, etc. Chris, we are so grateful to you giving up your Friday afternoon to talk to not only the students here and staff, but also wider members of the OP community. So on all our behalves, Chris, thank you so much.
At this point, I should say it's the benefit of a PGS education.
Okay, thanks so much, Chris.
Have a good weekend, everybody.
Bye-bye.